one held at the Pleasant Hill Library about 20 years ago when we were doing civic engagement series back then. So it's a real pleasure to have you speak to us today. Thank you so much, and it's all your show now.
Thank you very much, Liz, and thank you for the invitation again. I enjoyed these talks. I'm sorry that I can't be there in person, that none of us can be there in person, and I'm grateful for all of you who are joining us tonight. I guess you don't have a debate to watch tonight, so here you are. I am trying to share my screen, and Liz, can you tell me what you see?
So I see the U.S. immigration, it looks like a PowerPoint, but it looks like the slideshow, or not the slideshow set up yet.
Okay.
Change it to slideshow.
All right, here we go.
Let's see. At the very top, if you click slideshow.
Yeah.
Come over to the right, there you go. From beginning. That's it.
Here we go. Okay, so in the next 40 minutes or so, my task is to give you all an overview of immigration policy and immigration history in the United States, and it's not a small task. But I am gonna, because of the book that you've all read, I'm gonna take a little bit more time and talk about the Chinese Exclusion Act. But here's what I intend to run through very quickly. It's a lot, as I said. The Asian exclusion era, something called the 1917 literacy laws, the national origins quota system, which was primarily in the 1920s. And that was pretty much the immigration laws until the 1965 amendments. And then there were adjustments made. Just for your own information, I started practicing immigration law in 1975. And so much of what's on here is information and policies that I practiced with over the years and have seen the effects of firsthand. In the book that many of you have read, the era is the California Gold Rush era, and you should realize that some of you no doubt have heard about the Chinese Exclusion Act. Maybe you haven't. Maybe the only thing you've ever heard about Chinese in your history classes is about the role that Chinese played in the railroad. But for those of you who have heard about the Chinese Exclusion Act, you know that there was a period of time when Chinese were excluded from the United States, Chinese laborers. And it wasn't like that at the very beginning. The reaction to the Chinese is very much the reaction to various immigrant groups to the United States over the period of US history. We are a nation of immigrants, but we're a nation that loves to debate immigration policy. And that began with two of the icons of American history. The contrast is between George Washington, who gave many oratory about welcoming immigrants and refugees to the bosom of the United States, versus, of all people, Benjamin Franklin, who had a very different view of immigration to the United States. He was very early on opposed to German immigrants to the United States because he didn't want people speaking German in elementary schools and public schools. And so that debate over immigration started very early on. And that debate existed with respect to Chinese as well. Early on, there was praise for Chinese, that they were praised for being hard workers, that there was praise for them for working cheaper than other people. And that inevitably worked against them for a period of time. One of the first uses of Chinese in the railroad was actually by Leland Stanford, who put the Chinese to work on a railroad that he was trying to build here in the Bay Area and in California. And he realized what great workers they were, and he put them to work on the Western. He and his colleagues put Chinese to work on the railroad from the western part of the United States. And what many of you may recall from your U.S. history was the race was on. The reason why it was so important to lay track was because of the incentive. The incentive was that for any distance that you lay the railroad tracks, the owners of the company got to lay claim to the properties adjacent to the railroad. So the more railroad track you laid, the more property the railroad barons inevitably owned, and that of course contributed to the immense wealth of many of the people that own these railroad companies. But Chinese played a role in that, and they helped to line the pockets of many very, very wealthy families, many who ended up here in Northern California. So the Chinese did get early praise, but they also were the subject of backlash as well. There was criticism of the Chinese for not being able, they were viewed as not being able to be Americanized, if you will, even back then, that there was dissension among residents of California over the issue of why are Chinese eating such strange meals? Why do they speak a language that we can't even understand a word of? And so in California, in Oregon, there were very early efforts to pass laws against the Chinese. And in fact, that did happen. There were individual state and local laws that were passed against Chinese. For a very notorious one in San Francisco was passed in the mid 1800s. It was a Chinese Laundry Act that no laundry facility in San Francisco could be made out of wood, and presumably that was for fire safety reasons. But of course, there were many laundries that were owned by non-Chinese, but the only folks that law was enforced against were Chinese laundry owners. And so Chinese laundromats were closed down. So it made it hard for Chinese to do business. There were foreign miners acts, because after the railroad was built, many Chinese turned to mining, and there was mining legislation, a fee basically to do mining in California that was only enforced against Chinese and Latinos, people who had migrated from Latin America. So very much like anti-immigrant laws that have been enacted in states in the United States in the last 10 years, there were anti-Chinese laws that were enacted in the local and state levels to make life miserable, basically, for the immigrants that were not popular, at least in the eyes of the policymakers. Something that's not on this first list of bullets is that I should point out is that in 1868, in part of a celebratory mode towards Chinese, the United States actually convinced China to open up its borders to allow more Chinese to leave China to come to the United States. There was a treaty in 1868 called the Burlingame Treaty. And prior to that time, Chinese actually could not leave China very easily. If they did leave, they left under penalty of death. So there were nations of the world that did not want their nationals leaving, and China was one of them. But the United States convinced China in 1868 to allow more Chinese nationals, more Chinese laborers to leave China to come to the United States to help build the economy. But 2 years after that, again, just to show you the debate that was going on, in 1870, there were changes to the naturalization laws, the federal naturalization laws. Now, what a naturalization law is, it's a law that allows lawful immigrants to become US citizens. So many of you maybe, or your friends or relatives, have been lawful immigrants to the United States, and 5 years later, they take a history and government test and they get sworn in at a naturalization ceremony. That's what naturalization is. It's a method for lawful immigrants to become US citizens. Well, in 1870, prior to the passage of the 1870 naturalization statutes, the only people that were eligible for naturalization in the United States, the only people, lawful immigrants who could become naturalized citizens, were free white persons. Free white persons that's the way the Constitution read. Only free white persons who were immigrants could become naturalized US citizens. Now, anyone else who was born here was a US citizen, including Chinese. But as far as immigrants becoming US citizens, you had to be a free white person to become naturalized. So in 1870, the Congress had to address the issue, what about free black slaves? Because 1870, the Civil War is over, and there's a movement to allow people who were released from slavery to become US citizens. And so Congress did in fact change the naturalization law in 1870 to allow free black slaves to also become naturalized US citizens. But it read free black slaves and free white persons. And there was a debate in 1870 over whether or not Chinese should also be eligible to become naturalized citizens. And the United States Congress rejected that possibility for Chinese. So 1870, it marks a major federal statement against Chinese. 1875 is also a major statement against Chinese, and that is a provision that basically provided that no Chinese woman could enter the United States. Now, it didn't read that way. It read that women who were coming to the United States for possibly illegal purposes from China would be excluded. And the rationale that, again, this is a federal law, the rationale behind that was that, because mostly Chinese men were here at the time, it was a bachelor society, that probably women were coming to engage in prostitution. So therefore, that's what the Page Act was for in 1875. But the way the Page Act was enforced was essentially no Chinese women could immigrate to the United States either. And so it perpetuated the male-dominated bachelor society that existed at that time. The anti-Chinese sentiment continues, and it's led primarily by labor and by other xenophobic and racist elements on the West Coast of the United States. And it leads to what inevitably is passed, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. And that law basically prohibited Chinese laborers from entering the United States. So if you were a student or if you were a foreign dignitary, you could still enter the United States. Or if you were a merchant, you could still enter the United States. But other than that, you could not enter. And the effect of the Chinese Exclusion Act was immediate. If you look at demographic data of population changes in the United States over decades, beginning in 1882, the population, the Chinese population, just drastically declined after 1882 because of the Chinese Exclusion Act. So I'm going to move from there onto the 1907 Gentleman's Agreement with Japan. After the Chinese Exclusion Act, there was still this split personality that Americans had over whether or not we should welcome or not welcome immigrants, and in particular on this slide, whether or not we should welcome Asian immigrants. And the answer was that for a period of time, because the Chinese were excluded, the Japanese would be recruited. Japanese laborers were recruited, first to the Hawaiian Islands, but then also to the West Coast of the United States. But the Japanese ran into the same anti-immigrant sentiment that the Chinese did. And on top of that, the Japanese were more, they broadened their scope into the rural farmlands of places like California and Oregon and Washington. And there was resentment over Japanese beginning to become very prevalent in the farmlands. And so there was a push for a Japanese Exclusion Act. The problem was, and the reason why there was never officially something called the Japanese Exclusion Act, was because there was fear by the United States of Japan's military might. In 1905, Japan actually defeated Russia in war, and Japan was very well known around the world as a strong military force. So rather than risk war with Japan, the United States actually negotiated with Japan and convinced Japan that Japan should, on its own, restrict the number of Japanese laborers who could come to the United States. And in exchange for that, what did Japan get out of that? Well, two very important things. One, the United States agreed that in spite of the fact that the voluntary effort by Japan to no longer allow laborers from Japan to come to the United States, in exchange for that, Japan could allow women and children to come to the United States to join their husbands who were here, and also that if a Japanese man wanted to marry a Japanese woman through a picture bride arrangement, that also was permitted. So that was critical, because in contrast to the demographic impact of what happened to Chinese in the United States, for Japanese Americans, there was not a population decline. In fact, because they were able to have families, the Japanese American population continued to grow even after the 1907 Gentleman's Agreement. And in fact, the Japanese American community was the largest Asian group in the United States up until the 1970s. And that's no longer true. But until the 1970s, Japanese were the biggest group. Today, there are more Chinese Americans, there are more Filipinos, there are more Vietnamese than Japanese. But up until the 1970s, Japanese Americans were the largest group.
Bill?
In 1917.
There's just an orange box on the slide. Do you think you could just click that "Got it" on the bottom of that orange box?
Thank you.
Please.
Sorry.
Thank you.
And so in 1917, there was not, so Chinese were being excluded by 1917. Japan was restricting its numbers, but there was still anti-Asian sentiment. Who was coming? Well, there were people from India coming to the United States, and there were other smaller groups of Asians that were coming, and there was continuing to be an anti-Asian backlash. And so in 1917, the Asiatic barred zone was created. And so, as unbelievable as it may sound, the 1917 Act basically created a zone that anyone from that zone, no one from that zone could immigrate to the United States. That was known as the Asiatic barred zone. And the only exception to that was the gentleman's agreement with Japan, which could continue sending wives and children and picture brides. But by 1924, the hammer fell on Japanese as well. And so in 1924, the immigration laws were changed, and basically the law was not specific. No longer could Japanese enter. The law was basically said, anyone who is not eligible to become a US citizen through naturalization, no one who is not eligible for naturalization can immigrate to the United States. And since Asians could not naturalize, well, that meant that no one who was Asian could immigrate after 1924, and that included Japanese. Now, the final bullet on this page deals with the Philippines. And again, you need to know a little bit of US history to understand why there's a need for the United States to pass something called the Philippine Independence Act. And that's because, again, it has to do with war. That in 1898, the United States defeated Spain in the Spanish-American War. In 1898, the United States defeated Spain in the Spanish-American War. And two of the spoils, if you will, that the United States obtained as a result of that military victory was they got the Hawaiian Islands, but they also got the Philippines. They took possession of the Philippines because of the end of the Spanish-American War. And as many of you may know, Spain owned the Philippines for several hundred years prior to this, but the United States took over the Philippines in 1898. And so by taking over the Philippines, that meant that Filipinos were not aliens. Filipinos were what were called nationals of the United States. They were considered non-citizen nationals, but they were not considered aliens. And that's important because the immigration laws only apply to aliens. They don't apply to nationals. And so just as there was a backlash against Chinese, Japanese, South Asians, there was a backlash against Filipinos as well, because beginning in 1898, since Filipinos were not aliens, they could freely come to the United States. They could go to Hawaii. They could come to the West Coast. And because the United States imposed an education system on the Philippines beginning in 1898, Filipinos had to learn English in their public schools in the Philippines beginning in 1898. And so Filipinos knew how to speak English when they came to the United States between 1898 and 1934. And there was a backlash against it. There's a lot of literature about the Filipino-American experience during that era up until 1934. There's a famous book by Carlos Bulasan called America's in the Heart that I would recommend to people. It talks about his experience as a farm worker and other jobs in California. And it talks about how there was a resentment towards Filipinos because they could speak English, and they would frequent dance halls where they would dance with white women. And there was backlash against that. And so there was an attempt to pass a Filipino exclusion law, but you couldn't do that because the Philippines was part of the United States and they were not aliens. And so strange bedfellows occurred, and there were Filipinos who wanted, nationalists who wanted independence for the Philippines from the United States, and then there were these anti-Filipinos people in the United States, and so that led to the enactment in 1934 of the Philippine Independence Act, under which the United States granted the Philippines its own independence with a 12-year separation period, if you will. And so it didn't go into effect until 1946, but that's when the Philippines for sure was independent. But the notice was given in the 1934 Filipino Act and Independence Act. And so after that, Filipinos became aliens. Okay, I'm going to move on to some other groups now, because this is part of the whole history. In 1917, remember, that was also the year that the Asiatic Barred Zone was created. And as I said at the outset, there's anti-immigrant sentiment, that there are many groups that were targets of anti-immigrant sentiment. And no doubt many of you have heard about sentiment toward Irish immigrants. In the first decade of the 1900s, there were huge numbers of Southern and Eastern Europeans who immigrated to the United States. And that created a backlash. There was a backlash against Catholicism that was emblematic of anti-Italian sentiment. There was backlash against people of the Jewish faith and of other parts of people that were coming from Eastern Europe. And so a literacy act was passed in 1917 targeting those groups. And you basically had to be literate in at least one language to immigrate. And that was an attempt to clamp down on the large number of Southern and Eastern Europeans that had entered in the first decade of the 1900s. It was not very successful. And so in order to finally create a system to stop large numbers of Eastern Europeans and Southern Europeans from immigrating, the national origins quota system was established. And under the national origins quota system, the United States picked a period in US history that the United States felt had the perfect model racial makeup of the United States. And the period that they picked was 1890. So the population of the United States in 1890 was used as the model for determining what future immigrants should look like beginning in the 1920s. There was a bill passed in 1920 and another one in 1924. They were both called the National Origins Quota System. And so the way it worked was that Congress would come up with a number of how many immigrants could immigrate in any given year, but the proportion of visas that were issued to different countries was based on the proportion of that particular racial group that existed in 1890. And so because the United States in 1890, the vast majority of the United States was of Western European descent, that meant that the vast majority of immigrants from beginning in the 1920s could also only come from Western Europe. So the idea was to perpetuate a Western European country and to preserve the racial and ethnic makeup of the United States. And so that was the law. I mean, a country like Italy or any country of Eastern Europe, they might have quotas of at most just a few hundred immigrants each year, whereas other countries of Western Europe, they would have quotas of in the thousands. And so that's the system that existed until 1965. And the between the 1920s and 1965, there was an attempt to change the law. Harry Truman tried to change the immigration law to make it less racist, but it wasn't until John Kennedy was elected in 1960 that finally the legislation got traction. And when John Kennedy was a U.S. senator, he actually wrote a book called A Nation of Immigrants, and he won a book prize for that book. And he basically, as a senator, he challenged the country to be above the to rise above the racism that was epitomized by the national origins quota system. And he was advocating a first come, first served system. And that's what his vision was, that you should just pick a number of how many immigrants could come to the United States each year, and then just it's first come, first served. So if there are more people that apply from a particular country, there's going to be more people from that particular country. That is not what ultimately passed. As you all know, he was assassinated in 1963, but Lyndon Johnson did take up his mantle of immigration reform. And as you all know, in 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed. And on the heels of the Civil Rights Act, Congress took up immigration reform. And what we essentially ended up with is, rather than a first come, first served system, we now have a system to this day of per country numerical limitations. And so that each country essentially gets the same number of visas, so that a small country like Portugal will get the same number of visas as a big country like China. And but at least the national origins quota system was eliminated. Also, finally, the Asian exclusion laws were also repealed. Actually, they were repealed at the end of World War II, but they had tiny quotas because of the national origins quota system. They had quotas of 100 for China and 100 for the Philippines, that kind of thing. And so that was finally eliminated. The vestiges of the Asian exclusion laws were eliminated in the 1965 Act. And of a lot of importance is the fact that family reunification has been the emphasis of legal immigration since 1965. More than 85% of the immigrants to the United States each year come in a family reunification category. And that's given rise to some backlash. There are some people, including President Trump, who would rather not have family reunification as the emphasis. He would rather have skills as an emphasis. And that's a topic for another night, but that's highly debatable over whether or not that would produce what he thinks it would produce. And others, not just President Trump, who attack the family reunification categories, they think that the country would do economically better if we didn't have family immigration. That's a topic that I'm very, very opinionated about. And there was different treatment of Eastern Hemisphere and Western Hemisphere. Western Hemisphere, this 1965 Act, is the Canada, Central America, and South America, where the rest of the world is considered Eastern Hemisphere for purposes of immigration. There were changes in 1976. When I was starting to practice in 1975, I saw the big effect of this. There were waiting lists from Mexico, and the changes in 1976 basically reduced the number of visas available for Mexicans. And we still see the effects of this. Very, very long backlogs for immigration from the United States, which is one reason why there's been so much undocumented migration from Mexico over the last few decades, because the visa system doesn't accommodate people who would like to immigrate from Mexico. The other big important category is 1980, the Refugee Act was enacted. And before 1980, there was not an official asylum category. And so after 1980, there was, and when I started practicing, there were a lot of Southeast Asian refugees that came to the United States because of the end of the Vietnam War, and the United States felt obligated to allow those Southeast Asian refugees to come in. But because there was no official refugee category, whenever there was a war ended, World War I, World War II, the Vietnam War, Congress always had to pass special legislation to allow Hungarians to enter after the wars in Europe, to allow other refugees from Europe to enter after wars. And so finally, in 1980, Congress passed a special refugee act. And now there's essentially two categories. There's refugees that the president gets to determine every year. And then there's an asylum category for people who make it to this country either illegally or they come and they overstay a visa and then they apply for asylum. And in a big part of my life today, I have an immigration clinic at the law school. We are representing a large number of Central Americans that have entered at the southern border because of violence in Central America, and those individuals are attempting to apply for asylum in an orderly fashion at the border. In 1986, under the Reagan administration, the Immigration Reform Act was passed, and there was basically an amnesty program, and 3 million people were granted amnesty under a program that was signed by Ronald Reagan. 1986, also employer sanctions. That's the first time that there was a federal law that makes it a crime for an employer to knowingly hire an undocumented immigrant. So before 1986, an employer could hire undocumented immigrants. Not after 1986. It's not a crime to work without permission. If you're an undocumented person and you work without permission, that's not a crime, but it is deportable. You are deportable if you work without permission. 1996, big laws that made a big difference to the practice of immigration law. It makes it very difficult for anybody who's lawfully in the United States as a refugee or a green card holder. If you've been convicted of a serious crime, it's very difficult to be forgiven. It's very difficult to get a second chance. And so every day we do deport people from the United States who have lived here lawfully for many years, but made a mistake and have been convicted of a serious crime. It's people, they go to jail, they do everything else a U.S. citizen would do. A U.S. citizen would get out of jail after they serve their time and then try to go about their business. But somebody who is a lawful permanent resident would get out of jail and they would get deported. So they have that extra penalty. After September 11th, a lot of things happen. The immigration has been viewed now through the lens of national security since September 11th, 2001. And the Department of Homeland Security Act was established. DHS did not exist prior to September 11th. There's tons of resources that are placed at the border now, and billions of dollars spent for border enforcement and interior enforcement and detention. Even before Donald Trump had his idea of the wall, in 2006, during the Bush administration, Congress passed something called the Fence Act that would have built a fence along the southern border. It never got fully funded, but it was very bipartisan, the passage of the Fence Act. There were two illustrious Democratic senators who voted for the Fence Act of 2006, and their names were Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. They even supported the Fence Act of 2006. Family detention is something that I wish that people in the audience and the public would be more aware of. The United States detains women and children who have not been convicted of crimes, are trying to apply for asylum. The United States even detains children who have entered unaccompanied. Thousands and thousands are detained every night in the United States, and the detentions are awful. Maybe some of you heard just 2 weeks ago at one immigration detention center of women that were being given hysterectomies unknowingly. That was a detention center, that is an immigration detention center that is run by our government. And those kinds of human rights violations continue. I've been at many of these detention centers. I've been a court-appointed inspector of many of the detention centers, and I write affidavits of what I see, and believe me, they are not nice places to be. So let me stop there and take some questions. I guess I should at least point out that the Trump administration has done many things that I'm certainly not happy about as an immigrant rights person. And it's been not just from rhetoric over the wall, but travel bans, but also closing the southern border to people who I consider legitimate asylum seekers, making it more difficult for foreign students to come to the United States, even before the pandemic, not processing visas as quickly as they were in the past, making it harder to become naturalized US citizens, just creating a lot more red tape in the whole immigration world. Okay, so let me try to stop for the second time there and close this, and I'll stop sharing and open up to questions.
Do you want me to read those to you, or do you want to take them on yourself?
Yeah, why don't you read them, Carol? Are they in the chat or?
Yeah, so the first one was, can you talk about Americans losing their citizenship if they married a foreign person not eligible for US citizenship?
That's a pretty sophisticated question. There was a time in US history when if you, and it only worked, it was sexist. It only worked on women who were US citizens. If a US citizen woman married somebody who was an alien, who was not eligible for citizenship, the woman automatically lost her US citizenship. That was not true if it was a male who did that. And that was a law that ended, I believe that law ended in the 1920s, but that was a law. That's not the law anymore. If you are a US citizen and you marry somebody who's undocumented or somebody not eligible for citizen, you don't lose your US citizenship today. I know people for whom that was the situation.
Okay, next question. How were Chinese laborers brought into the Mississippi Delta region?
Yeah, so that's interesting because at the end of the Civil War, when Southerners felt that they needed to somehow replace the African slaves that they had, one of the places they turned to was the recruitment of so-called Chinese coolies to the United States. And there were definite efforts to do that. And so the interesting thing about Chinese migration is that even though it was obviously not an era of social media, word does get around. It did get around, of course, in months and years, measuring in months and years rather than in a couple minutes. But as soon as some Chinese were recruited to the South, like the Mississippi Delta, and I actually had two college friends that were grandsons of such people. Then word spread that there was opportunity, and so more and more Chinese entered and went to the South. And so I've known Chinese that were recruited to the Mississippi Delta, to Georgia, to the Atlanta area, and to places like Mississippi, not just Mississippi, but also Florida and other states. My own family grew up settled in Arizona, and it wasn't a matter of recruitment, but it was a matter of just word of mouth. It was one family member telling another family member about opportunities in Arizona, and for some strange reason, my father thought that that sounded attractive to him, and he ended up going to Phoenix to be a waiter in probably around 1917, and ended up opening a small grocery store about 60 miles east of Phoenix, and that's where I grew up, in the middle of nowhere, Superior, Arizona.
Okay. Next one. In the book, it mentions a large ship of Asian laborers brought in. What time period frame did this happen in?
Well, the earliest time period actually of Asians, and I include, and a lot of people don't, but I include Filipinos in that category. The largest group actually the earliest group were actually Filipinos, and that was as early as the 1600s, very, very early. But the Chinese laborers that are referred to in the book that were recruited, that was in the mid 1850s. There are legends that early Chinese, Maxine Hong Kingston has written about. There are legends that Chinese came much early, hundreds of years earlier. But in terms of the period of time that the book is talking about, we're talking about the 1850s.
Okay, can you speak to home or land ownership restrictions for immigrants in the 19th and 20th centuries?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I meant to mention that when I was talking about the backlash against Japanese owning farms in California, but I forgot. In California and Oregon and Washington, I'm pretty sure all three of the Western states, I know for sure in California, the date was 1912. There was a backlash, as I said, against the fact that Japanese were being very productive in the agricultural realm, and so in response to that, California and then subsequently Washington and Oregon passed laws that were known as the alien land laws. And basically what the alien land laws did was that they prevented anyone who was not eligible to become a US citizen to own or rent land. And so that meant that to own or rent farmland. And so that meant that no longer could Japanese or any other Asian own or rent those lands. And so they entered into odd arrangements sometimes. Sometimes Japanese, first of all, most of that land ownership was prevented after the alien land laws. The alien land laws were effective, but for people to try to get around it, the way they did it was because their children were born here, they would put the property in the name of their children, or sometimes an ally, a white neighbor who was more sympathetic, would hold the land for the person. Now, the alien land law was also interpreted to affect land ownership in metropolitan areas as well. In other words, not just rural areas, and that gave rise to a problem. There's a well-known case in California, in San Francisco, involving the YMCA. I'm sorry, the YWCA in Japantown, where there was controversy over that because, as all of you may know, in World War II, Japanese Americans from California were interned, and many lost their property, and they didn't know how long they were going to be gone, and so many sold what little land they had or transferred title. And so in the YWCA in Japantown, San Francisco, they decided to put, they own, there was a Japanese community that owned that property, and they turned it over officially to the YWCA to hold in trust. And decades later, this story ends about 15 years ago, where there was a dispute over whether or not the YWCA was actually going to give that land back to the Japanese American community. There's a big lawsuit, and it's called Sokobukai, SOKOBUKEI versus YWCA, and it was finally settled for a monetary amount, and so the Japantown YWCA is now back in the hands of the Japanese American community. But this confluence of the effect of internment and alien land laws came together to make it very, very difficult. But alien land laws were ultimately ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in the 1950s, I believe. And so, so those laws no longer exist. I mean, you should know, though, modern day, there are at least 3 towns that I know of. One in Hazleton, Pennsylvania. Another place is in Texas. I'm forgetting the name of the town in Texas. And another town called Fremont, Kansas. That those cities have passed ordinances that make it illegal for a landlord to rent an apartment to an undocumented immigrant. And 2 of those laws have been struck down, but the one in Kansas has been upheld by the Court of Appeals. And so I don't think that we've seen the end of efforts to stop at least undocumented immigrants from land ownership or even renting an apartment.
Okay, I think that's all we have for questions. Anybody else want to throw something in? Okay, well, thank you so much for coming. Oh, wait, there's another one. Can you talk about marriage to, let's see the rest of it.
Well, I'm going to guess what that question is about.
Okay.
Oh, okay, between races. Yeah, okay, that's a different question. That's a good question. And then somebody asked me about future trends. Many states, including California, passed laws that are called anti-miscegenation laws that prevented marriage between immigrants, and not just immigrants, but anybody of color and someone of a white race. And so not every state had those anti-miscegenation laws. The most famous one, of course, that there's been movies made out of it. There's a famous Supreme Court case about it that struck down anti-miscegenation laws, is called Loving versus Virginia. And I think that movie came out just a couple of years ago. And that was a marriage between a black woman and a white male. But anti-miscegenation laws affected immigrants. And for example, the reason why Chinese men remained a bachelor society was because in California, they could not marry people of a different race. And so you wouldn't find it lawful for a Chinese man to marry a white woman in California and in other states where there are anti-miscegenation laws. And so that's why the Chinese American community continued to die in population. Now, in other states, it was possible to get married. And in fact, I even know in my own family or relatives of interracial marriages that took place in the East Coast where that was possible, or at least relationships existed between people of different races. But it was very different. And the anti-miscegenation laws in California existed up until the 1960s, when the Loving versus Virginia law was upheld. You might also be interested in a chapter in California history involving marriages between Mexican women and South Asian men from India. And I can't remember the name of the book, but she's a sociologist from UC. I think she's now at either UC Merced or UC Riverside. But there was a book written on this interesting era where that because of the anti-miscegenation laws, the anti-miscegenation laws did not stop marriages between Mexican women and Asian, South Asian men, and so it's just a fascinating cultural phenomenon that occurred, and I have met many of the children and grandchildren from those relationships. There's a documentary film that is about this phenomenon as well, and it's just a great story where you'll meet people whose last name is Singh, and they're half Mexican and half South Asian, and they grew up speaking Spanish and eating Mexican food, and it's just a very fascinating chapter where, you know, if you can have an anti-miscegenation law, okay, fine, you can fall in love with another person of color. Somebody asked about trends for the future, and the outcome of the election is going to have a big impact. If Mr. Trump is reelected, I think we're going to see more of the same. And if Joe Biden is elected, I don't think you're going to see a radical change overnight, but you'll at least see the continuation of the DACA program, which is for undocumented young folks or people who entered as children who have grown up here. That program will at least get started. Continue. The big question is, will comprehensive immigration reform pass? And one of the questions that immigrant rights advocates are hoping occurs is a broad amnesty, similar to the 1986 law that Ronald Reagan passed, but even more broad. And it'll depend. It depends on whether or not the Republicans are willing to go along with comprehensive reform if they lose this election, or if the Senate if Democrats can control the Senate by at least 60 votes, which is a hard task to accomplish, because as many of you may know, you cannot pass major legislation in the Senate without defeating the filibuster. And in order to defeat a filibuster, you need 60 votes, not just 51.
And it looks like one more about what's been the most interesting case in your career.
Well, I don't know. I've had a lot of interesting cases. I mean, some of the most rewarding are, honestly, it's recent asylum cases where you get to win asylum for somebody who is the victim of gang violence or domestic violence from Central America because of the hell that those individuals have gone through. There's not a better feeling as an attorney, or certainly an immigration attorney, than prevailing for somebody who you know has a very legitimate basis for staying. And probably the case that many people know me for in the immigration world is a case that I helped to win at the Supreme Court in 1986, Cardoso Fonseca versus the Immigration Service. And it set the standard for what asylum should be, what somebody should prove to gain asylum. And basically, by a 6-3 opinion, the Supreme Court said that you should give the benefit of the doubt to somebody who's applying for asylum. If you're not sure, but you think there's a chance the person can be persecuted back home, then you should give the person the benefit of the doubt. And I'm proud of being part of that case. I don't think that the immigration officials apply the Cardoso Fonseca case properly, but we're still fighting that battle.
Okay, well, you got some very nice comments in the chat. So,
thank you.
Thank you again so much for being on our program tonight. We really appreciate it, and it's a great way to kick off our CoCo Reads series of events. So we're just very happy to have you.
Okay, thanks, Liz. Thanks, David.
Okay.
Thanks, Kim. Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.